A duke worth more than half of England rode into a dying estate, dressed like a stable hand, mud on his boots and a lie on his tongue. And he wasn't there to fall in love. He was there to catch a liar. And he got one. Just not the one he came for. Because by the end of that night, one sister would be crowned a duchess, and the other would learn that beauty was never going to be enough. And somewhere in a moonlit garden, hidden behind an old oak tree, a man who trusted no one was about to make the only reckless decision of his entire life. And this is the story of Louisa Halt, the daughter nobody looked at twice, and the duke who looked at no one else again. So stay until the end, because the ballroom scene alone is worth the wait. And now let us go back to where it all began. A cold, wet October, in a house that was slowly dying. Because the autumn of 1817 did not arrive at Farnell like a season. It arrived like a creditor, knocking on every door, tallying every candle, every log of firewood, every mouthful of bread that passed through its crumbling walls. And it seeped in through window frames that no longer fit their casings, painting the surrounding woods in shades of rust and slow decay, the house itself seeming to flinch from the cold, its grey stone gone dark with years of damp, its chimneys, once proud columns of smoke, now breathing only thin apologetic wisps, as if even the fires were ashamed to burn too brightly. Because Farnell had once been a proud and solid home, a home that rang with the sound of boots in the hallway, and laughter at the dinner table and fires that roared without apology. But now it was something smaller, a house of subtraction, fewer logs, fewer candles, fewer pleasantries, exchanged over a thinning dinner table. A house holding its breath and waiting for the day the last debt would finally collect what it was owed. And for Louisa Halt, this was simply what life had always felt like. Because she was 24 years old, the elder daughter, the practical one, the one who knew exactly how many days the last bundle of firewood would last, and which floorboards on the main stair groaned loud enough to wake her father, and which of her mother's old gowns could still be let out at the seams one more time, without falling apart entirely, and she did not move through Farnell as its mistress but as its keeper, quiet and watchful and indispensable and entirely unseen, like a hand that holds a crumbling wall together from the inside, invisible until the moment it lets go. And her beauty was of the same unfashionable muted sort as the house she tended, because where her younger sister, Henriette, was all sunlight, a confection of golden curls and startling blue eyes that seemed built for admiration and designed by nature itself for the specific purpose of being looked at. Louisa was dusk, her hair the deep brown of wet earth after rain, her eyes shifting between hazel and green, depending on the light, like something half hidden in a forest, her gowns refitted by her own hand from what had once belonged to her mother, soft greys and muted lavenders that Henriette called mouse colours, with a laugh that never quite reached cruelty but always brushed against it, and Louisa called them the colours of survival, because she had learned a long time ago that when a house is drowning someone, has to learn to swim quietly, without splashing, without drawing attention, without ever once asking to be pulled ashore first, and she had been swimming quietly for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand on solid ground. And the morning the letter arrived began exactly like every other morning at Farnell, which is to say, it began with cold tea and quiet dread. A sharp wind rattling the window panes of the breakfast room, Sir Alistair Holt sitting and staring into the dregs of his empty teacup, as though a solution to his ruin might rise up out of the leaves if he only stared long enough. Lady Holt fluttering about the table and rearranging the same 3 pieces of toast into different patterns, as if presentation could somehow multiply their number. And Henriette, radiant even in the depths of a sulk, tapping one perfectly manicured finger against the damask tablecloth and announcing to no one and everyone that it was simply too dreary. Another day of endless rain, and if they did not get to London for the season, she would positively wither away. And Sir Alistair flinched as though struck, because the London season was no longer a plan, but a ghost. The memory of a life the family could no longer afford to pretend they still lived. Every mention of it turning the screw a little tighter on a chest, already too compressed to breathe properly. And it was then that old Thomas the butler entered with his gait slower than Louisa remembered it being, even a year ago, carrying a single letter on a silver tray that had not seen polish in a month, and presenting it to Sir Alistair with the solemnity of a man handing over a verdict from a court that has already made up its mind, and the breaking of the wax seal was unnaturally loud in the tense hush of the room, and Sir Alistair's eyes moved across the page once and then again, as though he did not trust them the first time. His face, which had worn the same mask of weary defeat for years, undergoing a transformation Louisa had never seen on him before, disbelief giving way to a flush of high colour, giving way to something that looked terrifyingly close to hope, and he breathed the word Velmore, and the name sat strangely in the room, foreign and enormous, because the Duke of Velmore was a name spoken of in half-myths across 3 counties, a man of near-mythical wealth, unmarried, reclusive to the point of legend, who owned vast tracts of land in the north, and mines that bled silver out of the earth, and a title so old it seemed to drip history from every syllable. And Henriette sat up so fast, her chair scraped the floor, and boredom fell from her like a discarded shawl. And Sir Alistair's hands shook as he read aloud that His Grace's man of business proposed a contract to settle all outstanding debts in exchange for a marriage to his daughter, and the room went silent in a way that made the air itself feel thin, as though the house had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe out, because a marriage, a transaction, a daughter traded for a mountain of gold, and Henriette let out a small triumphant laugh, the sound of a prayer she had always assumed would be answered finally being answered. And she smoothed the front of her gown and said the Duchess of Velmore had a certain ring to it, and it never once occurred to her that the offer could be for anyone but herself. So completely and unthinkingly was it assumed, and Louisa did not even feel the sting of being overlooked, because she simply felt the cold, familiar calm settle over her, the calm of a girl who had long ago stopped expecting to be the one chosen. Because, of course, it was for Henriette. It was always for Henriette. The world had been arranged from the very beginning for girls like her, and Louisa was merely part of the scenery, the frame around the painting, never the painting itself. And she accepted this the way she accepted the cold tea and the thin toast and the floorboards that groaned, as simply another fact of the life she had been given. And Sir Alistair said the Duke would arrive in 2 days to finalize the arrangements, and they must prepare and make the house presentable. And so the next 48 hours dissolved into a flurry of panicked motion. Servants scrubbing carpets that had not seen proper cleaning in years, silver that had tarnished into a dull, apologetic grey polished until it gleamed with something almost like their old pride, and at the centre of it all, quietly directing every thread of chaos, was Louisa, organising the menus around what little the larder could actually provide, airing the linens in the best guest suite that had not been used in 3 years, walking the garden with the ageing groundskeeper, and choosing which of the wilting late-season flowers might still hold their heads high enough for a vase and she was, as she had always been, the sturdy scaffolding that let the beautiful facade of the family stand upright. While Henriette drifted through the preparations, like a queen surveying a coronation she had already assumed was hers, issuing contradictory orders and complaining about the shabbiness of the drapes, and quietly, privately practicing the particular tilt of the chin a duchess might use to greet an inferior. And Louisa did not begrudge her sister the excitement. She felt no flare of jealousy, and no bitterness she could point to and name. What she felt instead was a deep, bone-level weariness, the exhaustion of a life spent being endlessly useful and never once being truly seen. And she thought that soon the scaffolding would no longer be needed. Henriette would marry, and the debts would vanish, and Louisa would become exactly what unmarried daughters of ruined families always became. A spinster aunt living out her days on the charity of her sister's grand and distant husband, thanked occasionally, needed rarely, seen almost never. And it was a bleak picture, and she pushed it from her mind the way she pushed away every thought too heavy to carry, while there was still work to be done. And 200 miles south, in the solicitor's office in London, Jonathan, 6th Duke of Velmore, stood at a rain-streaked window and felt the walls of his own life closing in around him. Because on the desk behind him lay a letter from Sir Alistair Holt, its tone near hysterical, with gratitude and relief. And his solicitor, Mr. Atherton, said in his carefully neutral voice that the preliminary contract was accepted, and Sir Alistair would be a solvent man, and the Duke would have his dowry. And Jonathan did not turn from the window, but watched the grey London street below. The carriages and the hurrying umbrellas, all of it blurred by rain, and by his own exhaustion. Because £20,000 was a fortune to most men, but to him it was little more than a tourniquet. Enough to keep the men at the Tinsdale mine paid for another 6 months, and enough to shore up the most pressing of his father's debts, and enough perhaps to buy him a little more time before the great gilded house of Velmore finally collapsed into a pile of very expensive rubble. Because his father, the 5th Duke, had been a man of grand appetites and foolish investments, a man who had moved through the world as though consequences were a tax that applied only to smaller men, and the son had inherited the title and the land and the history and the rot festering quietly beneath all three. And for 5 years since his father's death, Jonathan had waged a silent, solitary war to hold the estate together, selling properties and slashing every expense that could be slashed, and working at his ledgers like a common clerk long past midnight, until the servants whispered that their master had become a cold and miserly recluse. And he did not care what they whispered, because he cared only about the legacy, and about the thousands of tenants and workers whose entire livelihoods hung from the same fraying thread as his own. And this marriage was his final, most desperate gamble. A baronet's daughter from a family gone to seed somewhere in the middle of nowhere. Found by Mr. Atherton, Sir Alistair Holt drowning in debt with a daughter of marriageable age, whose dowry tied up by a maternal grandmother's careful will her father could not touch until she wed. And Jonathan despised every part of it. Despised the necessity, and despised the transaction, and most of all despised the woman he had not yet met, because in his mind she already had a face, and it was not a kind one. A grasping country miss, raised on dreams of a coronet, pushed forward by a desperate father, circling him the way vultures circle something not quite dead yet. And so he turned from the window and told Mr. Atherton to cancel the carriage, because he would travel alone on horseback, and arrive a day early, and would not be announced. Because he wanted to see this family as they were, and not as they intended to appear for him, and the solicitor looked genuinely alarmed. and asked to what end, and Jonathan's voice was sharp enough to cut when he said to the end of truth. Because he was about to sell his name and his future to strangers, and he would not do it blind. And late on a drizzling Thursday afternoon, it was not a grand ducal carriage that rolled up the gravel drive to Farnell, but a single rider on a powerful black horse, wearing no fine wool and no gleaming boots polished for effect, but only the sturdy mud-splattered garb of a travelling man, looking if anything like a groom seeking work rather than a peer of the realm arriving to claim a bride. And he did not approach the front door, but circled the house toward the stables, leading his horse through the wet evening air that smelled of fallen leaves and old hay. And a stable boy ran out with wide eyes at the sight of the magnificent animal, and Jonathan said to take him and rub him down and give him a good feed, and that he was here on business for the Duke. And then he moved away, keeping to the shadow of a tall yew hedge, with no clear plan beyond watching and listening and learning the truth of the house before the house had a chance to perform it for him. And lights moved behind the windows, and he could hear raised voices and the clatter of pans, and the unmistakable sound of a household bracing itself for a formal arrival it did not know had already begun. And he found himself near a small walled garden, overgrown, but for a few hardy rose bushes clinging stubbornly to their last blooms. And through the tangled branches he saw a stone bench, and on it 2 figures, and he drew closer and melted into the deep shadow of an old oak. And the light was fading, but he could make them out well enough. One pure vision, golden-haired and gesturing dramatically, her voice carrying easily on the damp evening air, and the other sitting quiet. And still, beside her, a shape more suggested than seen, and Henriette was saying it was an outrage to be stuck here one more night, and that she had been ready for hours, and did he have any idea how difficult it was to hold a state of perfect radiance for an entire afternoon? And the quiet sister said nothing. And Henriette plucked at her own sleeve and declared the dress 3 years out of fashion, and said the Duke would think them paupers. And the other girl said, simply, we are paupers, Henriette. Her voice low and clear, and entirely without self-pity, stating it as a fact the way one might note that it was raining. And Henriette scoffed, and said they would not be for long. Once she was Duchess, she would have everything. A house in Mayfair, and a box at the opera, and jewels enough to drown in. She would burn the entire wardrobe, and never wear lavender again as long as she lived. And Jonathan felt something harden in his chest, because this was precisely what he had come expecting to find. Vapid and greedy, and entirely self-absorbed, and this was the girl he was to marry. And the thought left a bitter taste at the back of his throat, and Henriette went on telling her sister she should be happy for her, and calling it a sacrifice to tie herself to some dreary old duke she had never even met. And Louisa murmured that he was said to be very wealthy, and Henriette snapped that he had better be, because it was the only thing that could possibly make him tolerable, and she called him cold as a tomb, and silent as stone. And then she leaned in and dropped her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, and said that she would tell Louisa a secret. That once she was settled, and the Duke had served his purpose, there was always Lord Ashworth, who had always admired her, and that far more handsome than any duke. And a duchess may keep her little secrets, may she not? And Jonathan felt a muscle tighten in his jaw, because this was worse than he had imagined. Not merely greedy, but calculating, faithless, before the ink on the contract had even dried, and he had heard enough and turned to go, already composing the letter in his mind that would end this entire arrangement. And then the quiet sister spoke. And she said, Louisa should not speak so, and her voice had a new note in it now. Not judgment, but a kind of weary steadiness, and she said that Henriette was building a house on sand, that a title and a fortune were not a home, that kindness was a home, and honesty was a home, and those things could not be bought. And Henriette laughed a brittle mocking sound, and said that was precisely why Louisa was the one in grey, and she was the one who would be a duchess, because kindness did not pay the butcher, and honesty would not buy a new gown. And she called her a fool, and rose, and shook out her skirts, and swept away in a whirl of pink silk and self-importance, leaving her sister alone on the bench in the failing light. And Jonathan remained frozen in the shadows watching, and Louisa did not move for a long moment, and did not weep. He would learn much later that she had decided long ago tears were exactly what her sister wanted from her, and she had simply stopped giving them. And she only sat with shoulders lowered just slightly. The perfect picture of quiet defeat. And then she lifted one hand and gently touched a fading rose, still clinging to its thorny branch, her fingers tracing the wilting edge of a petal as though it were something worth mourning. And in that single unremarkable gesture, something shifted in the Duke of Velmore. Because he had come expecting to find a schemer, and he had found one. But he had also found something he had never once accounted for in any of his cold calculations. A woman, her own sister, had just called a fool, the one who spoke of kindness and honesty, the one who sat alone in the twilight in a faded grey dress, absorbing the casual cruelty of her family, with a dignity more profound than any coronet he had ever seen worn. And he looked in his mind at the marriage contract, sitting on Atherton's desk in London, and it specified a marriage to Miss Holt. And it did not specify which one, because Sir Alistair had 2 daughters and 2 Mrs. Holt, and he had come to Farnell to unmask a schemer, and he had done exactly that. But in doing so, he had also stumbled entirely by accident onto a woman of real substance standing in a house built of straw. And he did not feel guilty. That was the thing he noticed most sharply about himself in that moment. He simply felt resolved, because a choice had been made quietly and irrevocably somewhere in the space of a single held breath, and a slow, cold anger began building in him. Not at Sir Alistair, and not even entirely at the vapid, cruel younger sister, but at the wider injustice of it all, at a world built to reward girls like Henriette, and overlook girls like Louisa, again and again, without ever once noticing the pattern. And he had a choice now, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the Duke of Velmore felt something other than the crushing weight of obligation. He felt purpose. And he would honour the contract, and pay the debts, and marry Miss Holt. But he would be damned if it was the one everyone expected. And the household was in a state of high anxiety the next morning. The Duke expected at noon. Henriette awake since dawn and fussed over by her mother and a flustered maid until every golden curl sat in precisely its intended place. And Louisa had risen even earlier, ensuring the breakfast was laid, and the fires lit, and the thin veneer of respectability stretched as tightly as it would go over the many visible cracks in Farnell's foundations. And at precisely noon, the sound of carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive, and the family assembled in the hall, Sir Alistair sweating beneath his best coat, and Lady Holt wringing her hands raw, and Henriette standing slightly ahead of them all in pale blue, her expression the perfect careful blend of maidenly modesty and aristocratic welcome she had practiced for 2 full days in her mirror. And Louisa stood behind them near the door, a grey shadow ready to retreat the moment she was no longer needed, and Thomas opened the door, and a footman jumped down and lowered the steps, and out stepped the Duke of Velmore, not ancient and not wrinkled, but tall, and dressed in the impeccable, severe black of a man who required no colour to command a room, his dark hair unadorned, and his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes a startling stormy grey that swept across the assembled family with an unnerving lack of expression. Handsome in a way that was more intimidating than pleasing. And Sir Alistair bustled forward with hand outstretched and voice booming. And the Duke inclined his head, and his gaze passed over Sir Alistair and over Lady Holt and rested for a fraction of a second too long on Henriette, and he saw in that instant the practised smile and the avarice glittering just beneath it, and he saw in her posture and her performance everything he had already heard whispered in the garden the evening before, and then his eyes moved past her and found Louisa standing in the shadow near the door. And their eyes met 1 second, and 2, and 3, and she saw something flicker in the grey depths of his gaze. Recognition. And it made no sense to her, because she had never once laid eyes on this man in her life, and yet he looked at her as if he already knew her, and then he broke the gaze and turned back to Sir Alistair, and said in a voice that seemed to vibrate the very flagstones underfoot that he had reviewed the terms of their agreement. And Sir Alistair boomed with relief, flooding every word that his daughter Henriette was overjoyed to make his Grace's acquaintance, and Henriette performed a flawless curtsy with her smile dazzling, and said it was a pleasure to welcome him to their home. And the Duke did not smile, but something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but only the shadow of one, cold and assessing. And then he did the single most shocking thing anyone in that hall had ever witnessed, because he stepped forward past the stunned and beaming Henriette entirely, and stopped directly in front of Louisa, and the whole hall seemed to hold its breath at once, and he stood before her a towering dark figure, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes fully, and she could feel the sheer force of his presence like a physical weight against her chest, and she could smell rain and leather and cold, clean air, and he said, "You are Miss Louisa Holt," and it was not a question. And her voice, when she found it, was barely more than a whisper, saying that she was. And he gave a slight formal bow, and said, clearly carrying to every corner of the frozen hall, that the contract was for her hand in marriage, and the silence that followed was absolute and dense and heavy and unbroken, until Henriette made a small involuntary choking sound, and Sir Alistair's jaw dropped entirely, and Lady Holt rushed forward wringing her hands and saying Henriette was the beauty of the county, and the Duke said the contract specified a marriage to Miss Holt, and that he had 2 daughters, and that he was choosing the elder. And he held out one gloved hand, not a gesture of romance, but a gesture of command, an undeniable summons, and Louisa stared at the hand suspended in the air between them, and her mind spun in wild, ungoverned circles, asking why and why her, and it made no sense, and it felt like a mistake, a cruel joke played by some indifferent fate. But the look in his eyes was not a joke. It was serious, deadly serious, and Henriette finally found her voice, and it came out as a shriek, saying the offer was meant for her, and that father should tell him, and the Duke's expression did not change by so much as a flicker, and he simply waited, and Louisa looked at her family, and really looked at them, perhaps for the first time, seeing fury flash across Henriette's face, and craven panic in her father's, and only weeping confusion in her mother's, and none of them were looking at her. They were looking at the prize that had just been snatched away from where they had already spent it in their minds, and she had been a tool and a prop and a quiet functionary in the theatre of their lives, and now in an instant she had become an obstacle, and she looked back at the Duke, who was still waiting with his grey eyes, holding a single unspoken question, asking what she would do. And in that moment, Louisa Holt made a choice. not for the money, and not for the title, but for herself, because she was so tired of being invisible, and this man, for reasons she could not begin to understand, saw her. And so slowly and deliberately she lifted her chin and placed her small work roughened hand into his, and his fingers closed around hers, strong and warm and sure. And she said, "I accept your grace," in a voice, quiet but entirely unshaking. And the world tilted gently on its axis. And the days that followed dissolved into a blur of bewildered activity, Henriette retreating to her room in a storm of hysterics, with her sobs and accusations echoing down the corridor for the better part of 2 full days. And Sir Alistair and Lady Holt, moving through the house in a daze, caught somewhere between the relief of their family's salvation and utter confusion over the Duke's inexplicable choice. And Louisa, as always, became the calm centre of the storm. And the Duke was a man of swift, decisive action, with lawyers arriving within a day, and papers drawn and signed, and her father's debts settled in full, and a wedding date set for 1 week hence. And the Duke himself remained at the local inn, but called at the house each day. And their time together was formal and stilted and careful, walking the garden and sitting in the parlour, and he was impeccably polite, and asked her about the flowers in the vases and the books she read, and how a household as strained as hers had still managed to run so smoothly, and he listened to her answers with a quiet, unsettling intensity, as if every word she offered was being carefully filed away for later. And she learned things about him, only in slivers, that he disliked fuss of any kind, and preferred silence to small talk, and did not fill it merely for the sake of filling it, and that the staff at the local inn were faintly terrified of him, and yet he had personally quietly insisted on paying the stable boy an extra coin for the good care of his horse. A small detail that stayed with her far longer than it should have, and she never asked him why he had chosen her, because the question hung between them vast and unspoken, and she was afraid of the answer, afraid it might be pity or mere whim, afraid that if she prodded at it too directly, the entire fragile new structure of her life might simply collapse, and her wedding dress was not the confection of silk and lace a girl might have dreamed of as a child, because the Duke's man of business arranged for a modiste to be sent up from York, a practical, no-nonsense woman who took Louisa's measurements without ceremony and listened carefully to her requests, and Louisa said she should like something simple in a cream or a deep grey, something she might reasonably wear again. And the modiste looked at her strangely and said a duchess may have any dress she desires, and Louisa replied evenly that this duchess desired not to be wasteful, and she chose in the end a dress of heavy dove grey silk, cut in clean, exquisite lines with long sleeves and a modest high neck, and when she put it on for the first time, it did not feel like a bride's gown at all, but like armour. And they were married on a crisp October morning, in the small parish church nearest Farnell, her family standing stiffly on one side of the aisle, and the Duke standing entirely alone on the other, having no living family of his own left to summon. And he watched her walk toward him with his expression unreadable to the very last step. And she spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, and he spoke his in a low rumble that seemed to make the very air in the church shiver. And when he slid the plain gold band onto her finger, his touch was cool but unmistakably firm. And he was her husband, and she was the Duchess of Velmore, and it felt for all the world like a dream she fully expected to wake from at any moment. And after a brief, excruciatingly awkward wedding breakfast, they departed, and Louisa did not look back as the carriage pulled away down the drive, telling herself she was leaving behind nothing but a life that had never quite fit her to begin with, and the journey north to Blackwood Manor passed mostly in silence. Louisa watching the passing patchwork of autumn gold and brown through the window, and her husband sitting across from her reading. Apparently entirely at ease with a silence most people would have rushed to fill. And for this she found herself unexpectedly grateful. And Blackwood Manor was nothing like Farnell, rising out of the forbidding northern landscape as a vast dark structure of stone. Magnificent but not remotely welcoming, a fortress more than a home, and the full staff lined up to greet them, headed by a formidable housekeeper named Mrs. Graves, whose sharp, curious eyes took in the unlikely new Duchess, the plain grey bride nobody had expected. And that first night dinner was something close to a trial. The two of them sitting at opposite ends of a dining table so long they might as well have occupied separate rooms, the meal arriving course by course, served by silent, efficient footmen, crystal glittering and silver gleaming, and the silence between them stretching out immense and unbroken, and Louisa studied her husband from the far end of the table. A remote, handsome stranger she had somehow agreed to spend the rest of her life beside. And the question screamed silently in her mind, asking what she had done, and he looked up as though he had somehow heard it, and asked if the meal was to her liking, and she said it was excellent, and then gathered her courage, and said he must not call her Your Grace, because her name was Louisa. And he inclined his head, and said then she must call him Jonathan. And it was the first crack in the formal facade between them. A very small one, but a beginning. And later, Mrs. Graves showed her to her rooms, a full suite with a beautiful sitting room, and a private dressing room, and a vast cold bedroom, dominated by a canopied bed large enough for 4 people. And a single connecting door led, she presumed, to his adjoining suite, and remained firmly closed. And she sat on the edge of the enormous bed, with the grey silk of her wedding dress pooling around her, and for the first time allowed herself to feel the full terrifying weight of everything that had happened. And she did not cry, but the tears sat there regardless, a hard cold knot lodged behind her breastbone, because she had escaped one cage, she realized, only to find herself standing inside another, infinitely grander and infinitely colder. And Louisa woke the next morning with a new and unexpected resolve settling over her. A decision that she would not be a prisoner in this house, and would not become a decorative object gathering dust in some far wing of it. And if this was to be her life, then she would make it hers. And so she rose early, and rather than waiting to be dressed and attended, put on one of her simple Farnell gowns herself and found her way down through the labyrinthine corridors to the kitchens, the staff staring in stunned silence as the new Duchess of Velmore walked in among them entirely unannounced, and she said, "Good morning," and smiled a calm, genuine smile, and said her name was Louisa, and she hoped they would be friends. And she turned to the formidable Mrs. Graves and said she should like to learn this house from the bottom up, and asked if Mrs. Graves would show her. And Mrs. Graves, who had served the cold, silent Dukes of Velmore for 30 long years, was momentarily taken aback, but she saw in Louisa's steady eyes a complete absence of artifice, no performance, and no condescension. Just a genuine wish to understand. And so began Louisa's quiet conquest of Blackwood Manor, a patient campaign waged not with orders, but with attention, because she learned the names of every servant and the particular duties each carried, and she walked the larders and the still room and the laundry, not to interfere, but to observe, and to ask intelligent, genuinely curious questions. And she learned that Mrs. Graves was in the kitchen without fail by 8 each morning, and that the young maid Agnes was curious but kind and eager to be trusted with more than she had yet been given, and that old Thomas the gardener rarely spoke, A word yet somehow coaxed the most magnificent roses in the county out of the cold northern soil, and she found the library, a vast 2-story room, lined with thousands of volumes, every one coated in a fine layer of dust. And she spent her afternoons there, dusting and organizing and pulling back the heavy curtains to let in what little northern light the season allowed. And Jonathan watched her, though he said nothing of it directly. Returning from his long rides, or from hours buried in the study wrestling with his ledgers and finding small changes waiting for him each time. A bowl of late roses on the hall table, and the faint scent of beeswax polish where before there had only been dust, and the distant sound of quiet, purposeful activity where before there had only ever been silence. And one evening he arrived at dinner to find the great long table had been altered entirely, the vast middle section removed, and the 2 remaining ends drawn together, so that husband and wife could now sit close enough to speak without raising their voices across an empty gulf. A single simple candelabra having replaced the forest of ornate silver that used to stand between them. And it was intimate, and it was civilized, and it was unmistakably a home. And Jonathan paused in the doorway, taking it in, and looked at her, and for the first time she saw something new in his expression. Not assessment and not formality, but a flicker of genuine surprise, and beneath it something that might have been approval. And he took his seat across from her, and said simply that this was an improvement, and it was from a man like Jonathan, the highest praise he could possibly have given, and he began almost without noticing to seek her out. Coming to the library under the pretense of searching for some book or other, and finding himself simply staying. Watching her sit by the fire mending a tear in a piece of household linen with quick practiced stitches, and he began to talk to her. Nothing of great importance at first. The weather and a horse that had thrown a shoe and a passage in whatever book he happened to be holding. And she in turn began to see past the cold ducal exterior he presented to the rest of the world, seeing the weariness that gathered in his eyes by the end of each long day, and the way he worried at a stack of papers in his study with a brow furrowed in a frown he did not seem to know how to release, and she knew without yet knowing the details that he carried some great burden, and that he carried it entirely alone. And one evening she brought a cup of tea to his study unbidden, and he was hunched over a large ledger, with candlelight throwing the sharp planes of his face into stark relief. And he looked up startled, and said she needn't do that, because there were servants for it. And she set the cup at his elbow, and said simply that the servants were not his wife. And the word wife hung in the air between them, heavier than she had intended. And he looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not merely the Duchess of Velmore, and not merely the quiet girl he had plucked so impulsively from Farnell, but Louisa, a woman of quiet strength and unshowy kindness, who had brought him tea not out of duty, but out of genuine care. And he said thank you, in a voice unexpectedly rough, and she nodded and turned to leave, and he said her name, and asked her to stay, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. And she sat, and for a long while he said nothing at all, only stared into the low fire. And then he said the Tinsdale mine had flooded again, and the main pump had failed, and it would cost a fortune to repair. A fortune he did not have. And just like that, the wall between them came down, and he told her everything. His father's debts, and the failing investments, and the desperate years-long struggle to keep the estate from collapsing entirely, and the marriage contract, and the need for her dowry, and the reasons that had driven him to seek a bride so urgently, and he did not tell her about the disguise, because he could not yet bring himself to speak of that particular shame, of a man who had ridden in secret, to spy on the family he intended to marry into. And Louisa listened without interrupting, and without offering easy platitudes, and simply listened as he unburdened himself of years of solitary struggle all at once in a single unguarded evening. And when he finished, a heavy silence settled over the room, and he said he was sorry for having trapped her in all of this, and that it was not fair to her. And she met his gaze steadily across the desk, and said he had not trapped her, and that she had walked into this with her eyes open, and had chosen it. And he whispered her name, correcting himself. And she took a breath, and said, "You did not trap me, Jonathan." And the word hung between them like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. And she added that he was not alone in this anymore, because they were husband and wife now, and his burdens were her burdens as well. And he looked at her, this woman he had married ostensibly for money, this woman he had plucked from obscurity on nothing more than an instinct and a whim and a moment of reckless conviction in a darkened garden, and understood with sudden total clarity that in his desperate search for a solution to his family's ruin, he had accidentally stumbled onto the one thing he had never even known he needed: a partner and an ally and a friend. And the move to London for the season was Jonathan's decision, because he despised the city and its noise and its performance and its endless appetite for gossip. But it was a necessary evil, business to be conducted, and appearances to be maintained, and the world not to be permitted to learn that the Duke of Velmore stood so near the edge of ruin. And for Louisa, London was a bewildering new universe. The noise and the crowds and the sheer relentless scale of it leaving her breathless in a way Blackwood never had. But with Jonathan beside her, even the vast glittering chaos of the city felt somehow survivable. And their alliance, forged quietly in the study at Blackwood, had changed nearly everything between them, so that by now they were unmistakably a team, and society buzzed with curiosity about the reclusive Duke's new wife, the story of his strange choice having travelled ahead of them, the country mouse who had somehow trapped the lion. And ladies stared at Louisa in her simple, elegant gowns, with eyes bright with judgment, and whispered behind their fans as she passed. And Louisa met every stare with quiet dignity, polite and composed, and neither performing for them nor shrinking from them. And Jonathan was her shield at every ball, and swore his very presence beside her a silent warning to the gossips of the room, fiercely and visibly protective in a way that did not escape notice. And then Henriette arrived, appearing one afternoon in their drawing-room entirely unannounced, having attached herself uninvited to the party of a distant cousin. More beautiful than ever in the height of fashion, with her golden curls arranged with expensive precision, and her eyes sweeping the opulent drawing-room with a hungry, calculating gleam. And her campaign began subtly, with sweetness to Louisa's face and poison behind her back, planting seeds in every direction, telling tales of Louisa's strangeness and her plainness and her general unsuitability for the role fate had so inexplicably handed her, sighing to rapt circles of listeners at every gathering she could infiltrate that poor Louisa was always so odd, always hiding in corners with a book. A wonder the Duke even noticed her. One does rather wonder what hold she has over him. And Louisa felt the chill spreading through society almost immediately, and tried to ignore it, but it was like a slow poison, working its way in drop by drop. And Jonathan was furious, and said he would send her away, and Louisa said no firmly, that it was precisely what Henriette wanted, for him to play the tyrant, and for her to play the victim. And they would do neither, they would simply be. And Henriette was not content with mere whispers, because she wanted a public victory, and she found her weapon in a young, handsome, deeply indebted lieutenant, who had once paid Louisa a few weeks of mild and entirely unwanted attention, and a handful of whispered promises, and a hint at a conveniently paid gambling debt, and the young man was entirely hers to command. And the night of Lady Mariella's ball, the single most coveted invitation of the entire season, Louisa dressed with unusual care, and Jonathan had commissioned a new gown for her. Without her. Knowledge, not grey this time, but a deep, rich forest green cut, simply but sewn from heavy, lustrous velvet, that made her hazel eyes shine like something newly discovered. And when she descended the stairs, Jonathan was waiting at the bottom, and he stopped breathing quite literally for a moment, and said her name, and called her beautiful. The first time he had ever said the word to her, and it warmed her more thoroughly than any fire. And Lady Mariella's ballroom that night was a galaxy unto itself. Glittering chandeliers and sparkling diamonds, and air thick with perfume, and the low hum of gossip. And when the Duke and Duchess of Velmore were announced, a hush rippled across the entire room, with every eye turning toward the cold Duke and his controversial bride, and Louisa held her head high. And they danced together for the first time in public that night, and moved not as two separate people, but as one, his hand firm at her waist, and hers against his shoulder, moving through the steps of the waltz, as the rest of the room fell quietly away around them, and in the circle of his arms she was safe, and she was home. But the world did not stay away for long, because Henriette had been watching and waiting with her eyes narrowed, and she chose her moment during a lull in the music, and approached with the lieutenant trailing behind her, her voice pitched deliberately to Carrie, crying out how glad she was to see Louisa looking so well, and saying how lovely to see old friends reunited. And the implication hung in the air unmistakable. A secret past and an old connection carefully hidden. And the whispers rippled outward immediately, and Louisa felt the blood drain slowly from her face, and looked to Jonathan, and his face had gone rigid with cold fury, and his jaw was clenched tight, and for one terrifying instant she thought he believed it. And Henriette saw it too, and smiled her small, private, triumphant smile. But she had badly underestimated Louisa, and had underestimated the Duke far more badly still, because Louisa took a slow breath, and turned to her sister with quiet, cutting authority that sliced clean through the whispers, and said that Henriette was mistaken, and that she knew that perfectly well. And when Henriette pressed further, saying she distinctly recalled a journal, Jonathan stepped forward, and the cold fury radiating from him was enough on its own to silence the entire room, and he said, "My wife does not lie," each word landing like a stone dropped into a frozen pool, and he produced without hurry a folded paper from inside his coat, and told the lieutenant that, "When you choose to sell your honor, you ought to ask a higher price." And he named the promissory note for the gambling debts which he now held, and the lieutenant turned a sickly pasty white, and a collective gasp swept through the ballroom, and Jonathan turned back to Henriette, who stood frozen with every trace of colour draining from her face, and said perhaps they ought to speak instead of hers, and let the silence stretch unbearable and total. And then I was at Farnell a full day before I was expected. I was in the garden that evening. I heard a rather interesting conversation there, about a certain Lord Ashworth, about a duchess's little secrets, and Henriette looked as though she had been physically struck, and her mouth fell open, and pure horror spread across her face, as the memory of her own careless, cruel words came rushing back all at once, and Jonathan's voice dropped to a near whisper, yet somehow heard clearly by everyone present, and he said he had chosen his wife, not for her beauty, though she was in fact the most beautiful woman in the room that night. Not for her connections, for she had none to offer him, but for her character, and for her honesty, and for her kindness, and for a quiet dignity Henriette could not comprehend if she studied it for 1,000 years. And he turned to Louisa, and his eyes blazed with something fierce and protective and unmistakably like love, and he raised her hand slowly to his lips, and said to the entire silent watching room that she was his Duchess, and he would thank them all to remember it. And Henriette stood for one long, agonizing moment, entirely exposed and entirely defeated, and then with a single choked sob she turned and fled the ballroom with gold silk trailing behind her like a flag of surrender. And Lady Mariella stepped forward, tapping her cane sharply against the floor, and announced that someone play a waltz for heaven's sake. Because the Duke and his Duchess wished to dance, and as the music swelled back to life, Jonathan pulled Louisa into the centre of the floor and murmured against her hair that he was sorry she had ever had to doubt, even for a moment. And she whispered back that she hadn't, not really. And he said, "I love you, Louisa. I think I have from the very moment I saw you on that bench, being brave, in the dark." And she looked up at him, with eyes bright with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful to hold, and said, "I love you, Jonathan." And they waltzed on while the entire glittering room held its breath. And 1 year later, autumn sunlight slanted warm and golden through the tall windows of the Blackwood Library, illuminating slow drifting dust motes and falling across a room utterly transformed from the one Louisa had first found, the books organized now, and the brass gleaming and the furniture arranged into comfortable inviting clusters, and the heart of the house beating strong and steady at last. And Louisa sat in a comfortable armchair by the fire, with a book forgotten in her lap, watching her husband. On the floor, a place she never would have imagined finding him a year earlier, patiently showing a small carved wooden bird to a gurgling baby with a soft fluff of dark hair and a pair of startlingly familiar stormy grey eyes, and the Tinsdale mine had not in the end been lost. Because Louisa, with her practical mind and her hard-won gift for making much out of little, had spent hours poring over the estate's accounts and old survey maps alongside Jonathan, and it was she who had noticed a forgotten drainage adit recorded in a survey dating back to the 17th century, and it was her suggestion to clear and reopen it that had saved the mine, and with it the estate. And Jonathan called her his clever practical Duchess, and the tenants more simply called her a miracle. And Farnell had been sold, and Sir Alistair and Lady Holt had retired to a small comfortable cottage in Bath, where they lived out reduced but entirely solvent days. And Henriette had married a wealthy merchant twice her age, and it was said she kept a fine house, and owned more gowns than she could ever wear, but that she never smiled. And Mrs. Graves entered carrying a tea-tray, and smiling warmly at the domestic scene before her, because the whole house felt warmer now in every sense, full of life and full of laughter, and at last a true home. And Jonathan looked up and caught Louisa's eye, and smiled. No longer an almost smile, but something real and unguarded, that reached all the way to his eyes, and transformed his entire face. And he crawled over to her chair, and rested his head against her knee, and looked up at her, and asked what she was thinking, and she said she was thinking about a girl in a grey dress, sitting on a stone bench in a ruined garden. And he said, "I think about her all the time. I think about how lucky the man who found her was." And she corrected him gently, with a smile playing at the corner of her mouth, and said he wasn't lucky, he was simply paying attention. And he leaned up and kissed her, slow and gentle and full of love and gratitude, and the quiet, hard-won comfort of a shared life. A life that had begun as nothing more than a cold transaction between strangers, and had become through patience and kindness and the simple courage to truly see another person the grandest kind of love story there is. Because the quiet dignity of a girl in grey had outlasted every loud cruelty the world had ever thrown at her, and had brought her at last to this sunlit room together with the man who had finally truly seen her. And if this story moved you, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and do not forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.